Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. My name is Alexandra Supis. I'm really excited to present the work I've been doing with you guys. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, Jamie Napier, who you'll be hearing from shortly. She really spearheaded a lot of this work, as well as our co-authors, Joannika van der Toorn and Maria Laura Benton-Soli. So broadly, what we are asking in our research is how do members of stigmatized groups cope with the reality that their group suffers systematic discrimination? This cartoon, I think, personifies what we see as a strategy quite well. The doctor says to the patient, here's your problem. It looks like you're paying attention to what's going on. So we know that people in a stigmatized group face discrimination, and that discrimination leads to an increased likelihood of mental health issues. It's bad to be discriminated against. However, as Gordon Allport observed over 70 years ago, the mental health in minority groups is not greatly different from the run-of-the-mill society at large, which led him to conclude that victims of prejudice learn to lead their lives under a condition of mild dissociation. So what he reasoned was that this mild dissociation provides a shield for the otherwise toxic effects of stigmatization. So what might this mild dissociation look like? Well, we think it might look a lot like system justification. So believing that the system is fair provides a sense of order, certainty, meaning, security, and shared reality, all of which sounds pretty good. And we think that it can then, that those features serve a palliative function. So it can, for example, the palliative function can reduce moral outrage, but it can also promote life satisfaction. So what are ways that stigmatized people could kind of benefit from this system justification? They might have different strategies available to them, specifically because they are being treated differently. So they need to kind of square the fact that they're being treated differently against the idea that the system is fair. So one strategy they might use would be something like self-hatred, manifested through internalized self-hatred, something's just bad about me. That might rationalize it. Or alternatively, they might think that something about the group is bad, so I might want to distance myself from bad players. I'm not like that kind of group member. And the third possibility that we're going to really be focusing on today is they might minimize actually the idea that they're even discriminated against at all. So that's minimizing the perception that system level differences have accounted for what are otherwise impossible circumstances. So our first study to explore this, we had 133 gay men on MTurk. We had them kind of rate each of what we consider these strategies. So internalized homonegativity, maybe what's colloquially referred to as internalized homophobia. So just, not wanting to be gay. Another strategy gay men might use is group-directed homonegativity. That is wanting to distance yourself from bad players. Or of course, what we're interested in, which would be the minimization of discrimination. So for example, gay people saying, it's actually not that bad to be gay. Gay and lesbians who claim they're being discriminated against, they're overreacting. So we looked at these variables, these system justifying strategies, and we wanted to see if it predicted subjective well-being, so as measured on a 9-point scale. And we wanted to see if actually system justification would mediate these variables. And I think probably this group doesn't need to hear more about that scale. So of course, what we found, unsurprisingly, is the higher a person was on internalized homonegativity, the worse their subjective well-being. That's not surprising. We were surprised that group-directed homonegativity didn't predict subjective well-being. And then, as we expected to see, tendency to minimize discrimination was associated with better subjective well-being. When we went to see if system justification mediated this process, we saw that internalized homonegativity, the relationship it played with subjective well-being, was unaffected. Where system justification does come into play is mediating the relationship between minimization of discrimination and subjective well-being. So this was a good start to continue this line of research. In study 1, just to summarize, what we found was that minimization of group discrimination may be a system justifying strategy for LGBT men, or I guess GB men, to promote well-being in the face of adversity. Now, of course, there's an alternative and an important one. Maybe these gay and lesbian men or sexual minority men, maybe they weren't minimizing discrimination. Perhaps they just hadn't even been exposed to it. Great thing about America is it's very big and it varies greatly in terms of how bad discrimination is. So with a very large sample of people from across America, we could then go in and see if people's local level of discrimination moderated this relationship. So in study 2, we had a racially diverse sample of LGBT Americans, and we looked at their subjective well-being, their physical health, and their BMI, which is a measure of their body mass index. The independent variable, or what we're calling our system justifying strategies, we again looked at minimization of group discrimination and internalized homonegativity. And we also controlled for that kind of state level hostility. So the first thing we found, we looked at subjective well-being, and we again found the pattern that tendency to minimize discrimination was associated with better subjective well-being. It was also associated with better self-report of physical health. And finally, it was associated with lower body mass index, so essentially the propensity to be obese. And what we further found with body mass index is that this relationship between minimization of discrimination and BMI was moderated by LGBT acceptance. So what that meant in this case was that one's tendency to the relationship between minimizing discrimination and body mass index was strongest in the most hostile places, suggesting that people may be palliating in contexts where they need to the most. So where there's the most discrimination, they might be benefiting the most from minimizing that discrimination. So in the next study, we had perhaps a more homogeneous group in the sense that they were all New Yorkers. But again, it was a racially diverse sample of LGBT Americans. We had a much more comprehensive set of DVs for this study, including having received a medical diagnosis. For our independent variables, we again had the same two, minimizing group discrimination and internalized homonegativity. And we also included some alternative strategies, such as maybe group identification, which of course is associated with better well-being, as well as experience of personal discrimination. Because of course, you could be living in what is ostensibly a hostile state like Alabama, but your personal experience could still be very good. Or you could be living in a very liberal state like New York, and your experience could be quite negative. So first thing out of the bat, we found that minimization of discrimination was associated with better outcomes for all of our variables. The first set, the subjective well-being, these are scales such as social well-being, self-esteem, the CESD scale of depression, but it also was associated with the probability of having received a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder, a drug or alcohol dependence, any kind of mental health issue, or even having received a diagnosis of a physical health issue. It turned out, so those are I did this in green. So the green suggests kind of positive outcomes. So the more you minimize, the better your outcomes. And in red, I showed the more you experience discrimination, unsurprisingly, the worse your outcomes. We know that experiencing discrimination is bad. But what was interesting was that for 4 of our variables, there was an interaction between minimization of discrimination and experience of discrimination. And so what this meant is we were able then to address the question, how does minimization affect those who experience more versus less discrimination? And so what we found is the same pattern for all 4 of the variables, which is you see that top bar, those are the folks that had infrequent experience of discrimination. And you can see for those folks, kind of didn't matter if they minimized or they didn't, because they really weren't experiencing that hostility. But actually, when you look at the slanted bar, those are the people who frequently experience discrimination. We see that they get the benefit of minimizing, so that those who really are high minimizers are kind of looking from a well-being perspective, almost like those who didn't experience discrimination in the first place. And so I'll say we had the same pattern of results for self-esteem, for depression, and for likelihood of being diagnosed with a mental health condition. So to summarize these first 3 studies, we saw that minimization of discrimination serves a strong palliative function for members of the LGBT community, despite, and sometimes because of experiences with personal discrimination, either by living in a more or less hostile environment or because you've personally experienced discrimination. So our next question we wanted to ask is, does this generalize to other groups? Now, first, without doing our own research, we could see that there's evidence of minimization of discrimination among women. Other scholars have noted that women in more equal countries, for example, Sweden, often see more gender discrimination than those women living in objectively less equal countries, for example, Hungary. Now, Sweden and Hungary are kind of an easy example because those are the two ends of gender equality within Europe. And in Sweden, 27% of women will say, yes, there is gender discrimination within Sweden. And in Hungary, only 12% of women will endorse that. So we know that minimization must be happening. So what we're looking for by turning our attention to women is we're looking to replicate the pattern of data we showed with the LGBT population. So first, do women who minimize discrimination experience better versus worse subjective well-being? 2, is this mediated by system justification? And 3, is this moderated by the level of inequality they experience? The other thing that's nice about looking at women is we have a dominant referent group now. So we can also ask the question of, is the palliative function of minimizing discrimination, is it more present among women? So is this really a strategy that stigmatized group members turn to versus just anyone can turn to? So in that same vein, we can expect that the mediation of system justification should be among women compared to men, as well as the moderation of inequality. So for our fourth study that we're talking about today, we had about 800 US-based respondents. They responded to a 5-item life satisfaction scale. And in this case, we had, of course, our key variable, minimization of group discrimination. We also adjusted for experience of group identification and experience of discrimination. And our mediating variable was the system justification scale. So first, what we found among men, there was no association between minimization of discrimination and subjective well-being. But among women, we found the same pattern we had found among LGBT men and women, which was that those who minimize discrimination experience better subjective well-being. And furthermore, among the women, we found that this pattern was mediated by their personal level of system justification. And I should add, this wasn't, they weren't responding to the gender system justification scale. This was just the general system justification scale. So for our fifth and final study I'll be talking about today, we're going to be looking at women and men in 23 countries. This is an international conference, and we don't want to only center the discussion around American respondents. So we had between 500 and 1,000 people in these 23 countries. You can see there are countries that vary quite greatly on gender equality. So we had, I'm sorry, there's a typo, over 17,000 respondents, roughly half were female. And we had a single item to rate their level of happiness. And then we also had just a single item. We asked them to rate how much discrimination women face in their country. And so then for our measure of what kind of inequality these women and men are actually exposed to, we took an aggregate response to the World Values Survey of people within their home country to 5 items that gauge sexist attitudes. So these are items like, men should have more right to a job than women when men should have more right to a job than women when jobs are scarce. So these are just kind of general sexist attitudes. They're not specific to discrimination. So we know their level of sexism that they're exposed to. So the first thing I'll note about this study is across all the studies, we found that women were less likely to minimize discrimination than men. So this is showing the average denial of discrimination across all countries. You can see women are always lower on that scale than men. But the other thing to note here is you can see on our far left-hand side, we have Sweden, and that's replicating what others have found. The Swedes are the least likely to minimize discrimination, despite the fact that objectively their country has less gender discrimination. And all the way on the right-hand side, we see Russia. And so what we found was if you aggregate men and women, the level of denial of discrimination was highly correlated with our World Values Survey sexist norms item, which was correlated at 0.64. So what we found for the first time in this study was that minimization of discrimination was associated with better subjective well-being for men. However, it was more strongly associated with subjective well-being for women. And among women, we saw that country-level sexist norms moderated this relationship. And so what did that look like? So what you can see on the top, kind of the flatter line, those are women in the countries with low sexist norms. And you can see the level of personal denial of discrimination that they experience has less of an impact on their self-report of happiness. If you look at the bottom line, what you see is those living in more sexist countries that relationship between what they're, how much they deny discrimination and their happiness is much higher. So the people that are benefiting the most from denying gender discrimination are the women living in the more sexist countries. Now, what's interesting is you see this pattern looks a lot like our pattern for study 3, when we had LGBT Americans that either experienced infrequent discrimination compared to frequent discrimination. So of course, it's nice to see that 2 papers and 2 studies are really showing the same pattern among different groups experiencing different types of discrimination. So broad implications of this work. The current work demonstrates that minimization of discrimination is a system justifying strategy, even among stigmatized group members. We think that it's a potent coping mechanism, and perhaps it's even rewarding, that sets in place the potential to perpetuate inequality. It's enabling discrimination to thrive. So in an attempt to cope with the harsh reality, individuals are inadvertently supporting the system that created that reality. And we want to just add, we call this palliative rather than curative, because the effects of system justification, although it's creating a kind of positive illusion that promotes mental health for the individual, it also serves to maintain the social ills. So it's maintaining inequality and oppression, because even those who experience that oppression are not motivated to fight the system. So I think kind of a broader statement I would say is we need to consider other measures of progress to fight inequality than simply well-being. So finally, again, I'd like to thank my co-authors, as well as our colleagues, PJ Henry and John Jost, for feedback on this work. Thank you so much.